The air in the grand ballroom of the Volkov estate didn't smell like expensive perfume or aged scotch. It smelled like ozone before a lightning strike. It was the scent of 1,000 people holding their breath, waiting for a predator to blink. At the center of this gilded cage stood a boy. To the world he was a ghost in a tuxedo, a defect in a bloodline of iron. To the man sitting on the velvet throne at the head of the hall, he was a liability to be managed. But tonight the silence of the room wasn't just deafening, it was dangerous. Every eye was fixed on the girl in the midnight blue dress, the only person in the city brave, or foolish, enough to cross the invisible line drawn in the marble floor. Hello to everyone joining us today. It is truly wonderful to have you here in our storytelling community. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching and powerful journey of courage and unconventional love, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your country or city in the comments. I try to read as many as I can. Also, if you're new here or haven't done so yet, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. It helps us keep bringing these deep, emotional stories to life. And I promise you don't want to miss what happens when a woman of no status challenges the most feared man in the underworld. How are you all doing today? I hope you're ready because this story is a roller coaster. The music was a soft, haunting waltz, but for Ellen Ripley, a woman whose last name Vaughn usually meant she was invisible in rooms like this, the melody felt like a countdown. She wasn't a socialite. She was a caterer's assistant, a nobody hired to move trays and keep her head down. But her eyes kept drifting to the edge of the ballroom. There, standing near a towering Corinthian column, was 17-year-old Jack Torrance. Jack didn't look like a prince of a criminal empire. He looked like a boy trying to vibrate out of his own skin. His fingers were fluttering against his thighs in a rhythmic, frantic pattern. A stim that the guests around him met with sneers or pitying winces. Two massive men in charcoal suits stood 3 feet behind him, their hands hovering near their holsters. Not to protect him from the guests, but to ensure he didn't embarrass the family. Ellen felt a physical ache in her chest. She knew that look. It was the look of someone who was drowning in plain sight while everyone else commented on the color of the water. High above the floor on a raised dais sat Dominic Toretto, better known to the underworld as Dominic Corleone. He was a man carved out of granite and old scars. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept the room with the predatory grace of a shark. He didn't look at his son with love. He looked at him with a suffocating, possessive shadow. To Dominic, Jack was a porcelain doll with a crack in it, one that had to be kept in a dark cupboard so no one could see the flaw. Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She should stay in the kitchen. She should finish polishing the silver. But then she saw Jack's feet. Beneath the heavy fabric of his tailored trousers, his toes were tapping in time with the 3/4 time of the music. He wasn't just behaving. He was listening. He wanted to be out there. He wanted to feel the centrifugal force of a turn, the glide of leather on polished stone. "Don't do it, Ellen," her supervisor whispered, grabbing her elbow. "That's the Corleone boy. You don't even look at him. You look at him, you lose your job. You touch him, you lose your life." Ellen didn't pull away. She watched as a group of young debutantes giggled as they passed Jack, one of them purposefully making a loud, sharp noise just to watch him flinch and cover his ears. The guards did nothing. Dominic, from his throne, simply narrowed his eyes in shame. That was the spark. The white-hot flash of indignation that overrode Ellen's survival instinct. She set her tray down on a passing cart with a definitive clink. She smoothed her hair, straightened her spine, and began to walk. The sea of silk and diamonds parted for her, not out of respect but out of sheer, baffled shock. A common worker was walking toward the broken prince. The guards stepped forward, their shadows falling over Jack, who shrunk back, his humming growing louder, more distressed. But Ellen didn't stop. She stopped exactly 3 feet away, giving him space, acknowledging his boundaries. She waited until his darting eyes flickered toward her. "The rhythm is tricky, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft but steady, cutting through the judgmental hum of the room. "It's a 1-2-3, 1-2-3. Like a heartbeat." Jack stopped fluttering his fingers. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second the Mafia Prince persona vanished. He was just a boy who loved the music. Ellen reached out her hand, palm up, an invitation rather than a command. "I'm not a very good dancer," she lied, her smile warm enough to melt the ice in the room. I was wondering if you'd be willing to help me practice? The silence that followed was absolute. The orchestra trailed off into a discordant mess. The clinking of silverware stopped. At the head of the room, Dominic Corleone stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor sounded like a gunshot. The question wasn't just about a dance. It was a challenge to the entire social order of the Corleone Empire. Would the boy who was off-limits finally be allowed to touch the world? Or would Ellen Vaughn be dragged out of the hall before the next beat of the drum? Jack's hand trembled. It hovered over hers, twitching, hesitating. He looked up at his father, fear clouding his blue eyes. Then he looked back at Ellen. He saw no pity. He saw no fear. He saw a friend. His fingers closed around hers. Yes, he whispered, a sound so small it shouldn't have been heard, yet it echoed in the silence of 1,000 people. As the music flared back to life, the room watched in horror and fascination. But the real shock wasn't the dance itself. The real shock came when the music ended, and Jack Torrance Corleone, the boy who never spoke to strangers, gripped Ellen's hand and asked a question that would rewrite the destiny of the Corleone bloodline forever. The silence following Jack's question was heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on every person in the room. Ellen felt the eyes of 1,000 socialites and killers burning into the back of her neck. But her focus remained entirely on the boy in front of her. His hand was sweating in hers, his breathing shallow and fast, but his eyes, usually darting and distant, were locked onto hers with a desperate, singular clarity. Will you be my new mother? It was a plea for a lifeline, not just a title. It was the cry of a child who had been raised by wolves in suits and guarded by ghosts in dresses. Step away from him. The voice didn't need to be loud to command the room. Dominic Toretto Corleone was descending the stairs of the dais, each step sounding like the beat of a war drum. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, faces pale with the realization that they were about to witness a demolition. Dominic was a man who lived by a code of absolute control. To the world, he was the untouchable architect of the city's shadows. To himself, he was a protector who had lost everything, starting with his wife, Letty Ortiz, who had died in a tragic accident that was actually a targeted hit 5 years ago. Since then, Dominic had turned his grief into a fortress, and he had built that fortress around Jack. He believed that if the world couldn't see Jack, the world couldn't hurt him. He didn't see an autistic teenager. He saw a fragile piece of his soul that he had to keep locked in a vault. Ellen didn't move. She felt the 2 guards, Vince and Jesse, closing in. She could smell the gunpowder and leather on them. But she didn't drop Jack's hand. He's asking for a connection, Mr. Corleone, Ellen said, her voice vibrating with a courage she didn't know she possessed. He isn't a piece of furniture you can just park in a corner. Dominic stopped 3 feet away. He was a wall of muscle and expensive wool, his presence so intense it felt like he was sucking the oxygen out of the room. He looked down at Ellen, really looked at her, and saw something he wasn't prepared for. He expected greed. He expected a social climber. He expected terror. Instead, he saw Ellen Vaughn. He saw a woman who lived in a cramped apartment on the edge of the docks, who worked 3 jobs to keep her sister's medical bills paid, and who had spent every Sunday for the last 5 years volunteering at a youth center for neurodivergent children. He didn't know these facts yet, but he saw the residue of them in the set of her jaw. You have no idea what you're doing, Dominic growled, his voice a low vibration in his chest. You're playing with things you don't understand. Jack is special. He requires a specific kind of care. Care that does not involve public spectacles. He's not a secret to be kept, Dominic, she said, using his first name, a move that made the room gasp. He's a person. And right now he's a person who is terrified and lonely. Jack's grip tightened on Ellen's hand. He began to rock back and forth on his heels, a self-soothing motion that Dominic usually shut down immediately with a stern look or a hand on the shoulder. But tonight Jack was looking at Ellen. She danced, Jack whispered, his voice cracking. She didn't make the loud noise. She knew the rhythm. Dominic's expression flickered. A flash of pain quickly buried under a layer of ice. He remembered Letty dancing. He remembered how she used to hum the same waltzes to Jack when he was a baby to keep him calm during the thunderstorms. Take him to the car, Dominic commanded Jessie. No, Jack shouted. It wasn't a tantrum, it was a declaration. He didn't let go of Ellen. The standoff was reaching a breaking point. The guests were whispering, phones being tucked away. Dominic Corleone did not allow his family's private moments to be recorded. Ellen knew she was 1 second away from being physically removed or worse. Wait, Dominic said, his eyes never leaving Ellen's. He saw her protectiveness, the way she stepped slightly in front of Jack, shielding him from the judgmental glares of the crowd. He saw a woman who was willing to die for a boy she had known for 5 minutes because she recognized his worth. Dominic's motivation was always family above all. But he had forgotten that family meant more than just survival. It meant living. You, Dominic pointed at Ellen. What is your name? Ellen. Ellen Vaughn. Ms. Vaughn, you think you know what's best for my son? You think you can handle the weight of this world? He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. My son doesn't just need a dance. He needs someone who can handle the fact that his life is a target. He needs someone who won't run when the first shot is fired. I've been shot at before, Mr. Corleone, Ellen lied, mostly. She had lived in the worst parts of the city, she had seen the darkness. The only thing I'm afraid of is a child growing up thinking he's a burden. Dominic leaned in, his face inches from hers. The scent of sandalwood and danger was overwhelming. My son asked you a question. A ridiculous, childish question. But he doesn't ask questions. He doesn't speak to people. So here's the deal. You will come to the estate tomorrow morning. You will see what his life actually is. And when you realize you are out of your depth, you will leave and never speak his name again. And if I don't realize that? Ellen challenged. Dominic's eyes darkened with a mixture of irritation and a reluctant, terrifying spark of attraction. Then you will realize that being a part of this family is a life sentence. He turned to his son, his voice softening just a fraction. A glimpse of the father behind the monster. Let go of the lady. We are going home. Jack looked at Ellen. She leaned down and whispered into his ear, I'll see you tomorrow, Jack. I promise. We'll talk about the music. Jack slowly released her hand. He didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the crowd. He walked toward the exit with a newfound posture, his head held just a little higher. As the Corleone entourage swept out of the ballroom, the silence broke into a cacophony of gossip. Ellen stood alone in the center of the floor, her heart still racing. She knew her life had just ended, and a much more dangerous one had begun. The iron gates of the Corleone estate didn't just swing open. They retreated like a drawbridge guarding a kingdom of secrets. As Ellen Vaughn drove her beat-up sedan up the winding driveway, she felt the eyes of hidden snipers tracking her every move. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress of solitude and paranoia. The estate, a sprawling Gothic revival masterpiece, loomed against the gray morning sky, its stone walls covered in ivy that looked like grasping fingers. Before we see what lies behind those heavy oak doors, I have to ask, have you ever stood up for someone when everyone else stayed silent? It's a terrifying feeling, isn't it? If you believe that every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are, hit that like button right now. And if you're enjoying how Ellen is shaking up this underworld empire, make sure you've subscribed so you don't miss the moment Dominic finally meets his match. When Ellen stepped into the grand foyer, the air was cold, smelling of floor wax and stale history. There were no photos of Jack on the walls. No toys scattered about. No evidence of a teenager living there at all. It was a museum of mourning. This way, a voice boomed. It was Vince, the guard from the night before. He didn't look at her with the same disdain today. Now there was a flicker of pity in his eyes. He knew what happened to people who got too close to the boss's weakness. He led her to a wing of the house that felt even more sterile than the rest. Through a reinforced glass door she saw Jack. He was in a room filled with state-of-the-art sensory equipment, fiber optic lights, weighted blankets, and high-end headphones. It was a paradise of isolation. Jack was sitting in the center of the room, staring at a digital clock, his body swaying in a tight, controlled arc. He's been like that for 2 hours, a woman's voice said. Ellen turned to see a stern woman in a nurse's uniform. I'm Nurse Ratched. I manage the boy's schedule. He has 12 minutes of free thought left before his cognitive exercises begin. You are interrupting a very delicate balance, Ms. Vaughn. Ellen looked through the glass, her heart sinking. Jack wasn't being cared for. He was being managed like a biological experiment. He's a boy, not a clock, Ellen snapped, turning toward the sound of heavy footsteps. Dominic Corleone appeared at the end of the hallway, wearing a black silk shirt that made him look like a shadow come to life. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper in the morning light. The delicate balance is what keeps him from having a meltdown that lasts for days, Ms. Vaughn. It's what keeps him safe. Safe from what? Ellen challenged, walking right up to him. The world? Or from you having to deal with the fact that he has feelings you can't control with a spreadsheet? Dominic's jaw tightened. You speak with a lot of authority for someone who has been here for 5 minutes. Do you know what happens when he gets overstimulated? He hurts himself. He screams until his throat bleeds. My job is to prevent that. By turning him into a prisoner? Ellen pointed toward the room. He's not living, Dominic. He's waiting. Waiting for someone to acknowledge that he's actually in there. Before Dominic could respond, a crash echoed from inside the room. Jack had stood up and knocked over a tray of specialized educational blocks. He was clutching his ears, his face contorted in a mask of pure agony. The refrigerator, Jack screamed. The hum. Make the hum stop. Nurse Ratched reached for a syringe on a nearby cart. He's spiraling. I need to sedate him before he enters a full episode. No. Ellen shouted. She didn't wait for permission. She pushed past Vince, shoved the glass door open and ran into the room. Get her out of there. Dominic roared, but he didn't move to stop her. He was frozen, his face a mask of helpless terror. He hated seeing his son like this, and his only solution was to bury the problem under a chemical haze. Ellen didn't grab Jack. She didn't try to restrain him. Instead, she dropped to the floor, creating a physical barrier between him and the humming appliance in the corner. She began to hum, the same waltz from the night before. Not the loud orchestral version, but a low, resonant vibration that she felt in her own chest. Jack, she said, her voice a steady anchor in his storm. The hum is just a sound. It's the bass note. Listen to the melody. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Jack's screaming subsided into a jagged sob. He looked at her, his eyes wild. He reached out and grabbed her forearms, his grip bruisingly tight. Ellen didn't flinch. She leaned in, letting him feel her warmth, her presence. You came back, Jack gasped, his breath hitching. I told you I would, Ellen whispered. I don't break my promises, Jack. Especially not to friends. Outside the glass, Dominic watched, his hand resting on the frame of the door. He saw his son, the son he usually had to drug to calm down, gradually relax into this stranger's presence. He saw the way Ellen didn't look at Jack with the clinical detachment of the doctors or the suppressed shame of his own gaze. She looked at him with an absolute, unwavering belief in his humanity. Dominic felt a sensation in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And with hope came a terrifying vulnerability. Nurse, Dominic said, his voice raw. Put the needle away. But sir, the protocol is dead, Dominic growled. He walked into the room and stood over them. He looked down at Ellen, who was still sitting on the floor, letting Jack lean his head against her shoulder. You think you can give him a normal life? Dominic asked, his voice low and dangerous. You think you can take him out into a world that wants to kill me and mock him? I think we have to try, Ellen said, looking up at the most powerful man in the city. Because if we don't, you've already lost him. Dominic reached down, not to pull her away but to offer her his hand. As he pulled her to her feet, his touch lingered a second too long. The air between them sparked. A volatile mixture of mutual defiance and a sudden, sharp recognition of two lonely souls. Fine, Dominic said, his eyes burning into hers. You want to be his shield? You want to be his mother? Then you start now. But know this, Ellen Vaughn, if a single hair on his head is harmed because of your freedom, there is no corner of this earth where you will be safe from me. I'm not looking for safety, Dominic, she replied, her heart pounding. I'm looking for his life. This was the moment the war began. Not a war of bullets and territory, but a war for the soul of a boy and the heart of a man who had forgotten how to feel. The following weeks at the Corleone estate were a study in shifting tectonic plates. The rigid, silent atmosphere began to fracture under the weight of Ellen's presence. She didn't just move in, she invaded. She replaced the clinical white light bulbs in Jack's wing with soft, warm hues. She traded the silence for the low, comforting sounds of jazz and nature. But most importantly, she began to pull Jack out of the shadows. Before we witness their first foray into the world, I want to ask you all something deep. Have you ever felt like you were living in a cage of someone else's making? Maybe it was a job, a relationship, or just the expectations of others. If you've ever fought for your freedom like Jack is about to, let me know in the comments with a freedom emoji. And if you're rooting for Ellen to break these walls down, please subscribe and join our family. Your support is the fuel for these stories. He isn't ready, Ellen. You're being reckless. Dominic stood in the doorway of the conservatory, his arms crossed over a chest that looked like it was made of iron. He was watching Ellen pack a bag with sensory toys, noise-canceling headphones, and Jack's favorite snacks. He's been ready for 17 years, Dominic, Ellen countered, not looking up. The only person who isn't ready is you. You're afraid that if he goes to a park and has a good time, you'll have to admit that you've wasted a decade of his life keeping him in a vault. Dominic moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man of his size. In a heartbeat, he was in front of her, his hand gripping the edge of the table. I've kept him alive. My enemies, the Castellano family, would love nothing more than to use my son's condition as a way to get to me. To them he is a target. To me he is everything. Ellen finally looked up. She didn't flinch at his proximity. In fact, she leaned in. Then protect him out there. Don't just hide him. If you're the king of this city, make the city safe for your son. Or are you only powerful when you're hurting people? The air between them turned electric. It was the kind of tension that usually preceded a fight or a kiss. Dominic's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, a flicker of raw, unfiltered desire that he immediately tried to crush. He wasn't used to being defied, and he certainly wasn't used to being seen so clearly by a woman who had nothing to gain from him. 2 hours, Dominic growled, his voice dropping an octave. And I'm coming with you. If I see even a hint of a threat, we come back and the gates stay locked for a month. Deal, Ellen said, a triumphant sparkle in her eyes. The outing to the local botanical gardens was a revelation. For the first time, Jack wasn't being transported in a blacked-out SUV to a private clinic. He was sitting in the back of a regular, albeit armored, Suburban, watching the world go by with wide, wonder-filled eyes. When they arrived, the tension was palpable. Vince and Jesse followed at a discreet distance, their eyes scanning every bush and every passerby. Dominic walked beside Ellen, his hand hovering near his jacket, always on high alert. But then Jack saw the fountain. By turning him into a prisoner? Ellen pointed toward the room. He's not living, Dominic. He's waiting. Waiting for someone to acknowledge that he's actually in there. Before Dominic could respond, a crash echoed from inside the room. Jack had stood up and knocked over a tray of specialized educational blocks. He was clutching his ears, his face contorted in a mask of pure agony. The refrigerator, Jack screamed. The hum. Make the hum stop. Nurse Ratched reached for a syringe on a nearby cart. He's spiraling. I need to sedate him before he enters a full episode. No. Ellen shouted. She didn't wait for permission. She pushed past Vince, shoved the glass door open and ran into the room. Get her out of there. Dominic roared, but he didn't move to stop her. He was frozen, his face a mask of helpless terror. He hated seeing his son like this, and his only solution was to bury the problem under a chemical haze. Ellen didn't grab Jack. She didn't try to restrain him. Instead, she dropped to the floor, creating a physical barrier between him and the humming appliance in the corner. She began to hum, the same waltz from the night before. Not the loud orchestral version, but a low, resonant vibration that she felt in her own chest. "Jack," she said, her voice a steady anchor in his storm. "The hum is just a sound. It's the bass note. Listen to the melody. 1 2 3. 1 2 3. Jack's screaming subsided into a jagged sob. He looked at her, his eyes wild. He reached out and grabbed her forearms, his grip bruisingly tight. Ellen didn't flinch. She leaned in, letting him feel her warmth, her presence. "You came back," Jack gasped, his breath hitching. "I told you I would," Ellen whispered. "I don't break my promises, Jack. Especially not to friends." Outside the glass, Dominic watched, his hand resting on the frame of the door. He saw his son, the son he usually had to drug to calm down, gradually relax into this stranger's presence. He saw the way Ellen didn't look at Jack with the clinical detachment of the doctors or the suppressed shame of his own gaze. She looked at him with an absolute, unwavering belief in his humanity. Dominic felt a sensation in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And with hope came a terrifying vulnerability. "Nurse," Dominic said, his voice raw. "Put the needle away." "But sir, the protocol is dead," Dominic growled. He walked into the room and stood over them. He looked down at Ellen, who was still sitting on the floor, letting Jack lean his head against her shoulder. "You think you can give him a normal life?" Dominic asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can take him out into a world that wants to kill me and mock him?" "I think we have to try," Ellen said, looking up at the most powerful man in the city. "Because if we don't, you've already lost him." Dominic reached down, not to pull her away but to offer her his hand. As he pulled her to her feet, his touch lingered a second too long. The air between them sparked. A volatile mixture of mutual defiance and a sudden, sharp recognition of two lonely souls. "Fine," Dominic said, his eyes burning into hers. "You want to be his shield? You want to be his mother? Then you start now. But know this, Ellen Vaughn, if a single hair on his head is harmed because of your freedom, there is no corner of this earth where you will be safe from me." "I'm not looking for safety, Dominic," she replied, her heart pounding. "I'm looking for his life." This was the moment the war began. Not a war of bullets and territory, but a war for the soul of a boy in the heart of a man who had forgotten how to feel. The following weeks at the Corleone estate were a study in shifting tectonic plates. The rigid, silent atmosphere began to fracture under the weight of Ellen's presence. She didn't just move in, she invaded. She replaced the clinical white light bulbs in Jack's wing with soft, warm hues. She traded the silence for the low, comforting sounds of jazz and nature. But most importantly, she began to pull Jack out of the shadows. "Before we witness their first foray into the world, I want to ask you all something deep. Have you ever felt like you were living in a cage of someone else's making? Maybe it was a job, a relationship, or just the expectations of others. If you've ever fought for your freedom like Jack is about to, let me know in the comments with a freedom emoji. And if you're rooting for Ellen to break these walls down, please subscribe and join our family. Your support is the fuel for these stories." "He isn't ready, Ellen. You're being reckless." Dominic stood in the doorway of the conservatory, his arms crossed over a chest that looked like it was made of iron. He was watching Ellen pack a bag with sensory toys, noise-canceling headphones, and Jack's favorite snacks. "He's been ready for 17 years, Dominic," Ellen countered, not looking up. "The only person who isn't ready is you. You're afraid that if he goes to a park and has a good time, you'll have to admit that you've wasted a decade of his life keeping him in a vault." Dominic moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man of his size. In a heartbeat, he was in front of her, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "I've kept him alive. My enemies, the Castellano family, would love nothing more than to use my son's condition as a way to get to me. To them he is a target. To me he is everything." Ellen finally looked up. She didn't flinch at his proximity. In fact, she leaned in. "Then protect him out there. Don't just hide him. If you're the king of this city, make the city safe for your son. Or are you only powerful when you're hurting people?" The air between them turned electric. It was the kind of tension that usually preceded a fight or a kiss. Dominic's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, a flicker of raw, unfiltered desire that he immediately tried to crush. He wasn't used to being defied, and he certainly wasn't used to being seen so clearly by a woman who had nothing to gain from him. 2 hours, Dominic growled, his voice dropping an octave. And I'm coming with you. If I see even a hint of a threat, we come back and the gates stay locked for a month. Deal, Ellen said, a triumphant sparkle in her eyes. The outing to the local botanical gardens was a revelation. For the first time, Jack wasn't being transported in a blacked-out SUV to a private clinic. He was sitting in the back of a regular, albeit armored, Suburban, watching the world go by with wide, wonder-filled eyes. When they arrived, the tension was palpable. Vince and Jesse followed at a discreet distance, their eyes scanning every bush and every passerby. Dominic walked beside Ellen, his hand hovering near his jacket, always on high alert. But then Jack saw the fountain. It was a large, stone structure with water cascading over marble tiers. The sound was rhythmic, constant, and to Jack it was a symphony. He didn't run to it, he walked with a measured, tiptoed grace. He stood by the edge, watching the sunlight catch the spray. He's smiling, Dominic whispered, his voice sounding brittle. He stood a few feet back, looking at his son as if he were seeing a miracle. He's happy, Dominic, Ellen said softly, stepping closer to him. Look at his hands. They aren't fluttering. He's calm. In that moment of shared vulnerability, Dominic's guard finally dropped. He looked at Ellen, the woman who had dared to walk into his house and tell him he was wrong. He saw the way the wind caught her hair, the way she looked at Jack with pure, unadulterated joy. For years, Dominic had been surrounded by people who feared him or wanted something from him. Ellen wanted nothing but his son's happiness. Why are you doing this? Dominic asked, his voice barely audible over the water. Why risk your life for a boy you didn't know a month ago? Ellen looked at the water, her expression turning somber. I had a brother. Arnie Grape. He was like Jack. My parents. They didn't have your resources. They were ashamed. They kept him in the basement when guests came. They treated him like a secret. By the time I was old enough to do something about it, he was gone. A failure to thrive, the doctors called it. But I know what it really was. He died of a broken heart because he thought he was a mistake. She turned to Dominic, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I couldn't save my brother. But I can save Jack. And I'm not going to let you make the same mistake my parents did. Dominic reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, catching a single tear that had escaped. The touch was so tender, so out of character for a man of his reputation, that it made Ellen's breath hitch. You are a very dangerous woman, Ellen Vaughn, he murmured. You make me want to believe in things I buried a long time ago. The moment was shattered by a sharp whistle from Vince. Across the garden, near the rose bushes, 3 men in gray windbreakers had stopped. They weren't looking at the flowers. They were looking at Jack. Get him to the car. Now. Dominic commanded, the boss returning instantly. He stepped in front of Ellen and Jack, his hand disappearing into his waistband. The transition was violent and swift. Jesse grabbed Jack, who began to moan in distress at the sudden change in energy. Ellen grabbed Jack's hand, trying to anchor him as they were hurried toward the exit. As they sped away, Dominic sat in the front seat, his face a mask of cold fury. They followed us. The Castellanos know he's out. This is exactly what I told you would happen. No, Ellen said, her voice shaking but firm as she held a sobbing Jack in the back seat. What happened is that Jack had the best hour of his life. And your enemies saw that you have a heart. That doesn't make you weak, Dominic. It makes you a man. Dominic didn't answer, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the door handle. He was torn between the urge to lock Ellen away for her safety and the growing, terrifying realization that he was falling in love with the only person who had ever truly challenged him. The aftermath of the garden incident left the estate in a state of high-alert lockdown. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil and the oppressive silence of a house under siege. But inside the library, beneath the dim glow of amber lamps, a different kind of storm was brewing. The walls of the Corleone Empire weren't just being threatened from the outside. They were being dismantled from within. Before we uncover the truth that changes everything, I have to ask you, have you ever found out a secret that made you look at someone you love in a completely different way? It's a moment that shifts the very ground beneath your feet. If you've ever had to handle a game-changing truth, tell me your story in the comments. And if you're rooting for Ellen to find the strength to stay, please make sure you're subscribed. We are halfway through this journey and the biggest twists are yet to come. Ellen was in the library scouring through old records. She had noticed something odd in Jack's medical files. Gaps in his early childhood history that didn't make sense. As she pulled a heavy leather-bound ledger from the back of a shelf, a loose photograph fluttered out. It wasn't a photo of Letty. It was a photo of a woman she didn't recognize holding a baby Jack. The woman had the same distinct, soulful eyes as the boy, but she wasn't a Corleone. On the back, in elegant faded script, were the words, "For my son whom they will try to hide. Love, Maria. What are you doing in here?" The voice was a low thunder. Dominic stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hall. He looked at the photo in her hand and for the first time, Ellen saw true, unadulterated fear in his eyes. "Who is Maria, Dominic?" Ellen asked, her voice trembling. "And why does Jack have her eyes?" "Everyone told me Letty was his mother." Dominic entered the room, the door clicking shut behind him. He looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. He poured a glass of scotch, his hand shaking. A movement so subtle only someone who had been watching him as closely as Ellen would notice. "Letty was my wife. She was the queen of this family," Dominic said, his voice ragged. "But she couldn't have children. In our world, an heir is everything. If I didn't produce a son, my position was forfeit. My rivals would have seen it as a sign of God's disfavor." He took a long swallow of the amber liquid. "Maria was a surrogate. A girl from the village where I grew up. She was paid to give us a child. But when Jack was born and it became clear he was different, Letty couldn't handle it. She wanted him sent away. She wanted to try again. But Maria loved him. She saw what you see." Ellen felt the room spinning. What happened to her? Dominic looked at the floor, the shadows deepening in the hollows of his cheeks. "My father. The old man, he didn't want any loose ends. He told me she was sent away with a settlement. I found out years later that he had her eliminated to ensure Jack's purity as a Corleone. Letty knew. She lived with that lie until the day she died." Ellen felt a wave of nausea. The protection Dominic provided wasn't just about the Castellanos. It was a cage built on the blood of the woman who had actually loved Jack. "You've been lying to him his whole life," Ellen whispered, the betrayal stinging more than she expected. "You've been protecting the memory of a woman who wanted to discard him, while burying the woman who wanted him." "I was protecting him from the truth of this family," Dominic roared, slamming his glass onto the mahogany desk. "The truth is that we are monsters, Ellen. Everything we touch turns to ash. I kept him in that room because out here he is just a piece of a puzzle he doesn't understand. I didn't want him to know he was born from a lie." He crossed the room, grabbing Ellen's shoulders. His grip was desperate, pleading. "Then you walked in. You made him laugh. You made me feel like I wasn't just a ghost in a suit. I'm a coward, Ellen. I'm a man who can kill 100 enemies but can't tell his son who his mother was." Ellen looked up at him, her anger warring with a profound, heart-wrenching empathy. She saw the little boy in him, the one who had been raised in a world of violence and was trying to be better than his father but didn't know how. "You aren't your father, Dominic," she said, her voice softening as she reached up to touch his face. "But you will be if you keep keeping him in the dark. Love isn't about perfect bloodlines. It's about the truth." The proximity was overwhelming. The shared secret, the grief, and the months of simmering attraction finally boiled over. Dominic didn't hesitate this time. He leaned down, his mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that tasted of Scotch desperation and a decade of suppressed longing. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a surrender. In that moment the Mafia Boss vanished. He was just a man holding on to the only light he had ever found in the dark. Ellen moved her hands into his hair, pulling him closer, accepting the danger, the lies, and the man behind them. But the world outside didn't care about their revelation. A deafening explosion rocked the estate. The windows of the library shattered, raining glass down on them. Alarms began to wail, a high-pitched, piercing scream that Ellen knew would be Jack's undoing. "The Castellanos," Dominic hissed, his protective instincts snapping back into place. He shielded Ellen's body with his own as a second blast hit the front gates. "They aren't here for the territory. They're here for the boy." Dominic pulled a gold-plated handgun from under the desk and handed it to Ellen. "Go to Jack. There's a panic room in his closet. Do not open it for anyone but me. If they get past Vince and Jesse, you do what you have to do." "Dominic, wait." He grabbed her face, kissing her one last time with the finality of a man who didn't expect to survive the night. "I love him, Ellen. And I think I love you. Now run." As Ellen sprinted through the smoke-filled hallway toward Jack's wing, she realized the midpoint was over. The game had changed. The truth was out, the enemies were inside the walls, and the boy who just wanted to dance was about to become the center of a bloody war. The smoke in the hallway was a thick, acrid shroud that tasted of sulfur and pulverized stone. Every few seconds the world shuddered as another breach occurred. The estate, once a silent fortress, was now a screaming, dying beast. Ellen scrambled through the debris, her lungs burning, her mind fixed on one thing: the boy who was currently experiencing a sensory apocalypse. Before we witness the heart-shattering terror of this moment, I want to ask you, have you ever had to be strong for someone else when you were completely falling apart inside? It's a weight that can break the strongest of us. If you're standing with Ellen and Jack right now, leave a shield emoji in the comments. And if you're praying for Dominic to make it through the fire, please subscribe. We are in the darkest part of the night, and every subscriber is a light for our characters. When Ellen reached Jack's wing, the sound was unbearable. Jack wasn't just screaming. He was producing a high, thin, keening sound that pierced through the roar of gunfire. He was huddled in the corner of his room, his hands pressed so hard against his ears that blood was beginning to seep from beneath his fingernails where he had clawed at his skin. Jack, it's me." Ellen dove across the floor, shielding him as a spray of bullets shattered the remaining glass in his sensory room. The paradise of isolation was now a kill zone. "The noise. Make it stop. The stars are falling." Jack shrieked, his eyes rolled back. He was in a state of total catatonic shock, his body rigid as a board. Ellen grabbed the noise-canceling headphones from the floor, but they had been crushed by a falling beam. Desperate, she pulled off her velvet wrap and wound it tightly around his head, pressing his face into her chest to muffle the sounds of the massacre happening downstairs. "I've got you, Jack. I've got you," she whispered, though she could barely hear herself over the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a heavy-caliber machine gun opening up in the courtyard. Through the shattered doorway she saw the unthinkable. Dominic was in the foyer, fighting like a man possessed. He had discarded his jacket, his white shirt stained crimson. He was a whirlwind of calculated violence, but he was outnumbered. 3 men wearing the gray insignia of the Castellano family swarmed him. A heavy rifle but swung, connecting with the back of Dominic's head. Ellen watched in silent horror as the unbeatable boss of the city crumpled to his knees. Frankie Pentangeli, the Castellano enforcer, stepped over him, pressing a boot into Dominic's neck. "Check the boy's wing." Frankie roared. "Bring the freak out. We're going to show the city what happens to Corleone legacies." Ellen's heart stopped. She looked at the closet, the entrance to the panic room. It was 10 feet away, but the hallway was already crawling with shadows. She couldn't carry Jack. He was too heavy, and in his current state, any sudden movement would send him into a violent struggle. "Jack, listen to me," she hissed, her voice trembling. "We have to be Ghost. Remember the game? The silent waltz." Jack didn't move. He was staring at a flickering fiber-optic cable on the floor, his eyes glazed. The sensory overload had finally fractured his connection to reality. He was gone. The footsteps grew closer. Heavy, rhythmic, certain. "In here," a voice shouted. Ellen didn't have a choice. She looked at the gold-plated handgun Dominic had given her. She had never fired a weapon in her life. Her hands shook so violently the metal clattered against her rings. She realized with a sickening clarity that she couldn't win a gunfight. She did the only thing she could. She dragged Jack into the small dark space behind his bed, covering him with a heavy weighted blanket and piling pillows over them just as two gunmen burst into the room. "Where is he?" one of them growled, kicking over the sensory equipment. "The boss said the girl and the kid were here. Maybe they went to the basement. Check the vents." Ellen held her breath, her hand clamped over Jack's mouth. She could feel his heart hammering against her ribs like a dying bird. A single whimper, a single stimming click of his tongue and they were dead. As the gunman moved deeper into the wing, Ellen looked through a gap in the pillows. She saw them dragging Dominic across the lawn toward a waiting van. He was conscious but barely, his eyes searching the upper windows, searching for the boy he had spent a lifetime hiding. The van doors slammed shut. The engines roared. For the first time in his life, Jack was truly alone. His father was gone, his home was a smoking ruin, and the only person left to protect him was a woman with a broken heart and an empty gun. As the silence of the aftermath settled over the estate, a silence broken only by the crackle of flames, Jack finally spoke. It wasn't a scream. It was a hollow, haunting question. "Is the music over, Ellen?" Ellen looked at the destruction, the tears finally falling. "No, Jack," she whispered, her voice hardening into something cold and sharp. "The music is just changing. And this time we're going to lead." The darkest hour had arrived. The queen and the prince were trapped in the ruins of their kingdom, and the king was in the hands of his executioners. The charred remains of the Corleone estate stood like a skeletal warning against the moonlit sky. The sirens in the distance were fading, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and thick. Ellen sat on the floor of the ruined bedroom, her midnight blue dress torn and stained with soot. Beside her, Jack was staring at a blank wall, his fingers twitching in a complex, repetitive sequence. To an outsider it looked like a breakdown. To Ellen, who had studied every nuance of his behavior, it looked like a calculation. Before we witness the most incredible transformation in this story, I have to ask, do you believe that what others call a disability can actually be a hidden superpower? Jack is about to prove that his mind works in ways the world's greatest detectives couldn't imagine. If you're ready to see the underdog take charge, type "believe" in the comments. And please, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. We are heading into the final stretch and you won't believe the twist that's coming. "Jack," Ellen whispered, leaning into his line of sight. "They took him. They took your father." Jack's eyes didn't move but his fingers sped up. "6," he muttered. 624. Red shift. "The tires." Ellen froze. "What about the tires, Jack?" "The van," Jack said, his voice gaining a strange rhythmic authority. "The van that took him." The left rear tire was low. 28 psi. It left a drag mark in the gravel. A curve. A 17-degree arc. They didn't go to the main road. They went to the old industrial district. The pattern of the echoes. The sound bounced off the hollow silos. 624. That's the warehouse number. Ellen's jaw dropped. While she had been paralyzed by fear, Jack's hyperacute senses had been recording every frequency, every vibration and every visual detail of the attack. He wasn't just staring earlier. He was processing a map. "You know where they are," Ellen realized, a surge of adrenaline replacing her despair. "Jack, you can find him." "It's loud there," Jack said, a tremor of fear returning to his voice. "The machines. The metal." Ellen took his hands in hers. "I know it's loud. But your father is in the dark and you are the only one who can see the way out. You told me you wanted a new mother. Well, a mother's job is to believe in her son. And I believe you are the strongest man in this city." Jack looked at her and for the first time the prince looked like a soldier. He stood up, smoothing his rumpled tuxedo. "We need the keys to the silver car. The one with the quiet engine." They moved through the shadows of the estate, avoiding the first responders beginning to swarm the gates. Ellen drove, but Jack directed. He didn't use street names. He used the feel of the road and the frequency of the streetlights. "Turn left. The hum of the power lines is higher here," he commanded. As they reached the edge of the industrial district, the reality of their situation set in. They were two people against an army. But Ellen saw a duffel bag in the trunk, Dominic's emergency kit. It didn't just have guns. It had blueprints, burner phones, and something Jack gravitated toward immediately: a high-end tactical thermal imaging headset. "I can see the heat," Jack whispered, putting them on. "I can see the heartbeats." In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. Ellen saw the fear in Jack transform into a singular, hyper-focused mission. He wasn't being managed anymore. He was the strategist. He began to map out the warehouse, identifying the positions of the guards based on the rhythm of their pacing. "They are waiting for the sun to rise," Jack noted. "That's when they'll do it. That's when they'll kill him." "Then we don't give them the sunrise," Ellen said, her voice cold with a newfound ferocity. She reached out and took Jack's hand, a silent promise. They weren't just a victim and a helper anymore. They were a team. They were the only hope for a man who had spent his life trying to protect them from a world he thought they couldn't handle. "Ready, Jack?" Jack adjusted his noise-canceling headphones, a small, confident smile playing on his lips. "1, 2, 3, he whispered. "Let's change the music." The industrial district was a graveyard of rusted iron and shattered glass. But through Jack's eyes, it was a grid of energy and vibration. The Castellano warehouse loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. Inside, Dominic Corleone was being broken. Outside, the two people he had tried to save from the world were about to burn it down to get him back. "Before we reach the heart-stopping climax of this rescue, I have to ask, have you ever been underestimated? Have people looked at your challenges and assumed you were weak, only for you to prove you were the strongest person in the room? This is Jack's moment. If you are cheering for him to show the world what he's truly capable of, drop a power emoji in the comments. And if you want to see justice served, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. The ending is going to leave you breathless." "For guards on the perimeter," Jack whispered, his voice steady, his eyes locked into the thermal headset. "They aren't looking for us. They're looking for an army. They don't see the small things." Ellen looked at the duffel bag. "How do we get in, Jack?" "We can't outgun them." "We don't outgun them. We overstimulate them," Jack replied. He pointed to the massive external power transformer feeding the warehouse block. "The frequency is unstable. If I bypass the surge protector, I can create a high-decibel feedback loop through the internal PA system. It will be loud. For them it will be a distraction. For me it will be a shield." Ellen watched in awe as Jack moved with surgical precision. The boy who used to flinch at a humming refrigerator was now intentionally weaponizing sound. He rewired the terminal with a calm focus that was almost terrifying. "Now," Jack said. He slammed the final connection. A deafening, ear-splitting shriek erupted from the warehouse speakers, a frequency so sharp it felt like a physical blade. Inside, the guards screamed, clutching their ears, their coordination shattered. "Go!" Ellen cried. They moved through the side service door. The warehouse was a maze of shipping crates. In the center, under a single flickering bulb, Dominic was strapped to a chair. His face was a mask of blood and defiance. Frankie Pentangeli stood over him, holding a jagged blade, his face contorted in pain from the noise. "Shut it off." Frankie screamed to his men. "Find the source and kill it." Ellen stepped out from behind a crate, the gold-plated gun leveled at Frankie. Her heart was a drum, but her hand didn't shake. "Let him go, Frankie. Now." Frankie laughed, a wet, nasty sound. "The caterer? You think you can?" Thwack. A heavy, steel-toed boot connected with the back of Frankie's knee. Jack had moved through the shadows of the crates like a ghost, his silence his greatest weapon. As Frankie buckled, Jack didn't stop. He used a heavy industrial wrench to strike the pressure points he had memorized from his anatomy books. It wasn't a mafia hit. It was a clinical neutralization. "Jack." Dominic croaked, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked at his son, the boy he thought was fragile, standing over a fallen enforcer with the cold, focused gaze of a guardian. Ellen rushed to Dominic, slicing through his zip-tie restraints. "We have to go. The noise won't keep them down forever." But as they turned to flee, the heavy bay doors groaned open. Don Castellano himself stood there, flanked by 6 men with submachine guns. The noise had stopped. The trap had closed. "Impressive," Castellano sneered, stepping into the light. "The boy has teeth. And the girl, she has spirit. It's a shame I have to kill all 3 of you to maintain the balance of power." Dominic stood up, swaying, his arm around Ellen for support. He looked at Jack, then at Ellen. He didn't look like a boss anymore. He looked like a man who had finally found something worth more than his empire. "You want the balance of power, Castellano?" Dominic's voice was a low, lethal growl. "Look at my son. You called him a defect. But he's the one who found you. He's the one who broke your security. He's the future of the Corleone name, and he's twice the man you'll ever be." Jack stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his father. He didn't hide behind Ellen. He didn't cover his ears. He looked Castellano in the eye and said, "The rhythm of your heart is 110 beats per minute. You're afraid? You should be." Suddenly, the warehouse was flooded with red and blue lights. The sound of a dozen sirens wailed outside. "The police." Castellano hissed. "You called the cops?" "A mafia boss called the cops." "I didn't call them," Dominic said, a small, triumphant smile touching his bloody lips. "My son did. He set an automated emergency trigger the moment we entered the district. In 10 seconds this place will be crawling with every officer in the city. You can stay and fight them, or you can run and lose everything." The shock wasn't just the rescue. It was the realization that Jack had used the system against the underworld. He had changed the rules of the game. Castellano fled into the night as the tactical teams breached the doors. In the chaos, Dominic pulled Ellen and Jack into a tight, crushing embrace. "You saved me," Dominic whispered, his voice breaking. "Both of you." "We're a family, Dominic," Ellen said, leaning her head against his chest as the sun finally began to peek over the horizon. "And families don't leave anyone behind." The morning sun rose over a different kind of Corleone estate. The blackened stones had been cleared, and in their place a new structure was rising, one with floor-to-ceiling windows that invited the light in rather than hiding from it. The iron gates were still there, but they stood open, welcoming the world instead of warding it off. Before we reach the final, heart-melting moments of this journey, I want to thank you for sticking with us through every twist and turn. This story reminds us that love isn't about control. It's about the courage to let someone be exactly who they are. If this story touched your heart today, please leave a comment with the word family. Lets me know that these messages are hitting home. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button to join our community. We have so many more emotional stories to share with you. A year had passed since the night at the warehouse. The Castellano family was a memory dismantled not just by the law, but by a city that had grown tired of the old ways. Dominic Toretto Corleone still commanded respect, but his power had shifted. He was no longer a shadow dweller. He was a man who invested in the future. Ellen Vaughn stood on the new veranda watching the gardens. She wasn't wearing a caterer's uniform anymore. She wore a simple, elegant sundress, and on her finger sat a band of gold and emeralds, a gift from a man who had learned that the greatest treasure wasn't a territory but a partner. "He's late for lunch," Dominic said, stepping out behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. He smelled of expensive cedar and, for the first time in years, peace. He kissed the side of her neck, a lingering, devoted gesture. "I told him 12 o'clock. "He's not late, Dominic," Ellen smiled, leaning back into him. "He's just finishing his set." From the distance, the sound of a piano drifted through the air. It wasn't a haunting waltz or a rigid exercise. It was a complex, beautiful piece of jazz, full of syncopation, unexpected turns, and a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. They walked toward the music room, a space designed with perfect acoustics and soft textures. There sat Jack Torrance Corleone. He was 18 now, his shoulders broader, his gaze steady. He wasn't playing from a sheet of music. He was playing from his mind, translating the patterns of the wind and the birds into a melody that made the air feel alive. When he finished, he didn't flinch as they entered. He stood up and walked toward them, his movements confident. He hugged Ellen first, a long, grounding embrace that she returned with tears in her eyes. "I have a surprise," Jack said, his voice no longer a whisper but a clear, resonant tone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I got the letter. The Conservatory of Music. They want me to start in the fall. They said my perspective on frequency is unlike anything they've ever heard." Dominic took the letter, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at the son he had once tried to hide from the world, the boy he thought was broken. He saw a young man who was about to conquer a stage far bigger than any mafia boardroom. "I'm proud of you, Jack," Dominic said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled his son into a fierce, protective hug, not the hug of a jailer but of a father who was finally ready to let go. "I told you," Ellen whispered, joining them. He was never the one who was limited. We were. The three of them stood there in the light of the new afternoon, a family forged not just by blood or names, but by the fire of a shared struggle. Ellen looked at the man she loved and the boy who had become her son in every way that mattered. The Mafia Boss had surrendered, not to an enemy, but to the transformative power of a woman's bravery and a son's unique light. As the music of Jack's piano echoed through the halls once more, it wasn't a song of secrets or fear. It was a song of new beginnings. The dance that had started in a cold, silent ballroom had finally found its true rhythm, a rhythm that would never be broken again. Did you enjoy this story? Tell me your name and where you're watching from. And tell me if you'd like more stories like. Don't forget to like this video and also subscribe to enable YouTube algorithm push more videos like this your way.